Hey, I'm Alex Ratcliffe from Board Game Co. and today I'm reviewing Paperback Adventures from Fowers Games. Paperback Adventures is a 1 to 2 player roguelike deck building word game, and if you're like, those are words you haven't heard together in a while, that's because it's not a very common genre. Paperback Adventures is primarily solo. I did say 1 to 2 players, we'll come back to that. It's primarily a solo experience in which across 6 various creatures, 3 lackeys and 3 bosses, you're going to be building up your deck, adding more items, gathering MacGuffins to help you along your journey as you slowly choose a character. There's going to be a few characters, we'll get to that shortly, as well as the various enemies you're fighting against across an iterative sequence of battles as you try to improve yourself against stronger and stronger enemies. The core game requires, well, this core box. This will give you these things you need to actually play, but then you need at least one of these 3 hero boxes. Each hero box comes with a few extra bosses, a few extra enemies, a few extra items, a few extra MacGuffins, just other things you can kind of shuffle into your core experience. And then, of course, the bulk of it comes with the character. Their items, their awards, the specific way that character has unique abilities and ways that they'll play through the game. But you're going to choose that character, you're going to set it up, get all your stuff up and running as far as this goes, and then you're going to have your starting deck of cards, which you're going to go ahead and shuffle. And from there, you're going to start the process of trying to build out wards to take down your enemy. You see the sequence of plays, you're going to draw 4 cards, you're going to look at your 4 cards, take a look at these, and then try to come up with a word that utilizes the letters, not just the most letters. One of the things about Paperback is it's not about having the most, it's about having the right combinations, because when you have a card, let's go ahead and show you how this works out. Right now we have S-O-R-L. Now, as you might imagine, there's not a ton we can actually do with that combination. The good news is whenever you're fighting against an enemy, you have their weakness over here. So for example, we have the letter E, which is this particular deep sea diver's weakness, which means there's a letter E on the table we can incorporate into our word. Suddenly we have a little bit more we can do. We can do soar if we wanted. We can do soar. We don't use the L for that one. Is there anything we can do with all of the 4 letters over there, all 5 letters? Lores. Lores is, there's definitely lore. I don't know if there's lores. Is there slore? Slore is not necessarily a thing. I don't know necessarily the best word over here, and I'm not going to spend my time trying to come up with the best word over here. What I will say is, before we get further into that, there's also a wild in play. You have a wild as well as the weakness letter. You also have a wild card you can use. Although if you don't use it, you do get an energy, so there is an incentive to not use it. This card won't help you, it will hurt you. Now this is also where some of the difficulty scaling comes into play, where you'll have different abilities on the other side depending on whether you're playing with the easier or weaker side of this card. So you might have different little symbols over there, and that's important because right now the boss letter and the wild are there to help you create a word, but they don't actually contribute to your symbols on the left or right side of the card. For the purpose of actually just moving forward and not really focusing too much on this, let's pretend we wanted to do soar. This is where you have to choose how you want to display your cards. You see, you could do soar like so, displayed that way, which will give us a lot of defense against the enemy who's currently going to deal 3 damage to us and gain 3 crowns. So we can completely ignore that attack. Alternatively, we can go ahead and try to go a bit more on the defensive and display them this way, in which case we're not going to get this left side hand. We're going to instead get the right hand side of things, and we're going to get 3 attack, 2 energy, and a shield. We'll also get shields down, which is an effect that could help us but could not because we are being attacked at this moment. Because a part of what the game comes down to is trying to choose whether to display your cards left or right, focusing a little bit more defensively or a little bit more offensively, but also the ability on that card. The difference between soar and lore, because I think we're going to actually go ahead and switch this up. Right now we have soar, which will give us those symbols, which is great, but shields down will give the enemy a few of these little purple symbol, this purple skull, which will hurt him, but it also will add additional damage. Shields down is great when they're not attacking us, not as great when they are attacking us. On the other hand, if we do metal shell won't help us either. We're going to stick with soar, because we could switch it up to lore, which would give us metal shell as the top ability instead, but 1 less attack. For right now, we'll stick to soar, and let's watch how this plays through. So, we're doing shields down, which means we're going to go ahead and resolve that. We're going to be able to do shields down 2, which means we're going to up this stat by 2. We're doing 3 damage to him. He has no defense. You can check over here to see if he has defense. He's going to lower from 8 to 5. But then additionally, we're going to get 1 defense and 2 energy. We're going to bump our energy up by 2. And then we'll go ahead and we're going to have 1 defense against this 3 attack, which means we will take 2 damage. 3 minus 1 is 2. And then we'll also go ahead, he will gain 3 crowns, which is going to use those because he has an ability, armor. Every crown on him prevents the damage from an attack and is then removed. So effectively, he buffed up his armor, which is, well, not the best for us. That's a round of play. We're going to go ahead and discard all the cards we use. This card's going to go back to the boss pile. These go away. We'll draw up 4 more cards. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we go to the next round. He's going to move his action indicator 1 lower. Enemies have a sequence of actions often where they're going through, going to the bottom, and then right back up to the top. They're going to have the health point, and then enemies also have 2 stages. When we eventually do reduce his health points to 0, we will flip him to the other side. He'll be temporarily stunned, but he introduces a new health, resets the health back up to 10, and goes through a new action sequence starting at the very top top of that action sequence over here. You're going to go through the enemy that way, trying to take them out. A few small other things worth touching upon before we go on to the next part, which is the enemies. You're going to have your own item cards, your core cards you start over here. These are going to cost energy to use. So we have laser eyes, which cost 1 energy, and we can spend up to 4 of those skulls to do up to 7 damage to them. Additionally, throughout the course of the game, you'll have more items you can buy, each of which have a card in them. So for instance, plot armor over here gives every letter in your wards an additional defense. It will cost us 3 energy, but it'll give us a strong defense turn, which can be very helpful in terms of making sure we don't die on the turns you don't want to die. Those are most turns, by the way. That's basically the cycle. You're going to have a little deck building going on. At the end, one thing I did not touch upon, whenever you create a ward, whatever ward you created, that ward over there that we did, that soar is going to have that top card, the card that used the ability, is going to be removed and fatigued. There are things that will bring it back into play, but you have 1 less card in your deck, which means as you slowly go through creating more and more wards, you are eventually getting to a point where your deck is getting smaller and shorter and less in it, and you could eventually just fatigue yourself to death where you just don't have the cards you need to take down your enemy. Once you do take down your enemy, you're going to go ahead and reference their card. We have all these cards for all the various enemies in the game, but all these cards giving you the 2 sides to the enemy. In our case, we have the deep sea diver over here. So you're going to look at the enemy's card in question, and you're going to take a sequence of rewards. There's 2 different sides, each with a small degree of narrative flavor text, but they all have different rewards you have. You can draw a card from the library to replace a card in your deck. That means this library pile over here, you're going to be adding better cards to your deck that way, or replacing them. We have draw 3 items and choose to keep, so you can draw some items here. We can draw a random MacGuffin. So we're going to draw a little MacGuffin over here. These are going to be these cards here. We'll draw a random one from the middle there, and we can either have the Orb of Seeing, which lets us peek at the top card of your deck, and the penalty deck. The penalty deck's over here. And we also have the spare parts over here. At the start of every boss battle, gain 2 energy and 1 crown. So you have different MacGuffins you can use that will slowly power up your character going along with your items. And then lastly, we have draw 2 cards from the penalty deck and add them to your deck. And again, these are different rewards you can have. This side only has 2 rewards, but you don't have the penalties, so you have to try to choose which side you think will best suit you. Additionally, in addition to the boss rewards, in between each battle, you also have the opportunity to go ahead and spend any crowns you earn throughout the course of the battle on these piles over here. We have items that will cost 2 each. We have MacGuffins that will cost 3 each. That's all listed on the shop card. And then we have upgrading a letter, which costs 2. Upgrading a letter means taking a letter out of its little sleeve over here, and then putting it on its other side. So right now, this R over here gives you 2 of those, but when we upgrade it to this side, will be worth 3. So you have little ways of upgrading your cards across each battle that you can use to further hurt the enemy, and that is basically what's going on in Paperback Adventures. You're going to be fighting a total of 6 enemies, each with 2 stages. So you're going to have 3 lackeys, you're going to have a stage 1 lackey, a stage 1 boss, a stage 2 lackey, a stage 2 boss, onwards and so forth. You have this giant pile of all these various people you're going to be fighting against or potentially fighting against. There's a large pile, and this pile only gets larger as you add cards from the various boxes to them. That's going to be true for the items, the MacGuffins. Basically, the core box comes with the main things you need, but every character box is going to give you more stuff you can shuffle into the main system, as well as giving you the specific character you're playing as. And each character comes with their own abilities and the way their deck works and how you're going to have their own little way that they interact with the game and their strengths and weaknesses that they have that you have to play around. And that is Paperback Adventures, which brings us to the review. Starting off, before you get to the review, as far as 2 players, there is a 2-player mode to play this game. It is primarily designed as a 1-player game with a 2-player mode to jump into. I have not played the 2-player, so I'm not going to comment on that past just saying there is a 2-player mode. As far as diving into the review, starting off with ease of play, the rulebook is actually not the best. Now, this is not a hard game to learn, so it's not that big of a deal, but I would say the rulebook is not well formatted and the information is not presented as clearly as it could be. I think the core game sequence is pretty simple to get into, but there's a lot of edge cases and lack of clarity in the rulebook, and again, just the formatting and layout of everything. I definitely struggled more than I think I should, given the actual complexity of the game, which is not that high. As far as game length, this is one you definitely want to be aware of, which is it is a long game. At least it's a long game if you don't die, that is. Assuming you don't die, and dying is possible. This is a hard game, and it can take a few runs to get your feet wet and understand the best way to play the game, and there is a lot of difficulty modification around it. There's ways to make the game easier and harder, which is a good thing. But regardless of all those factors, the game itself, if you actually make it through a full run, can easily be in the 2.5 to 3 hour range, even as a solo experience. Part of that's just the nature of trying to constantly build out that perfect ward, but you do want to take your time and think through how to survive. Thinking through how to survive will make the game last longer because you're actually not dying, but it means you have to take the time to think through and plan around it. This is a game where you could pack it up and save it, by the way. Everything is saved nicely, and these, for better and for worse, these stick much harder than they should in this, which means everything here is great as far as savability, but it is is one that if you're going through a single run, it could be 2.5, 3 hours easily. As far as what I like, don't like, I can see others not liking, starting off with what I mentioned, which is, it is a hard game. This is not an easy one to just dive into. Again, you could make it easier, but unless you do, this is one where you will have to struggle through it. You will likely lose your first run, maybe even your second run, maybe even your third, and once you feel you actually have your feet down, once you feel you have a good handle on it, it is one where you can add more ways to make the difficulty scale around you and how you're doing in the game. So I like the fact that it feels challenging. I like the fact that it constantly feels, as you build out your cards, as you try to build up and augment your character, you constantly feel challenged by the system. And speaking of building out your character, that's another huge part of the game that I love. We have these full libraries and decks just full of stuff that you're trying to add to your deck. The various items, MacGuffins, upgrading letters, adding more letters. You have a lot of upgrading going on in the game, a lot of ways to improve yourself and feel stronger, which is important because the bosses are a lot, and they take work, and it is going to take dedication to get through them, and so building up a completely different character every single game. Your characters, you already have a few characters to pick from, assuming you get a bunch of characters, but then even past that, you have the ability to modify that character and how they feel very much, which gives you a lot of replayability to the experience, and just a lot of fun with all the powers and abilities going on there. And there's the roguelike aspect as well to the experience, as you defeat different bosses, you'll slowly add cards to your decks, which isn't necessarily that important, because a single run won't have you going through anywhere near all the cards anyway, but you will add the possibility of, as you defeat things, as you go through the game comes with little envelopes of ways to add more stuff into your system, which can give you, well, more stuff to do and a sense of unlocking as you go through it. And overall, I would say that as far as word games goes, this very much solves some of the problems I have with word games. I love word games in general, but word games with board games, when they've been done, I find that they often fall into the trap of me trying to come up with the perfect word, or more importantly, you trying to come up with the perfect word, while we sit around the table and wait for that person to do so. And so everyone's constantly trying to think through, well, if I add this, if I combine this, I can get those 6 letters out of it. It can be hard. It can be very AP prone to constantly feel like there's a word that's just out of reach, and if you spend enough time, well, everyone else won't like you, but you'll get that word you want. By making this a solo game, you can do that. You can do that as much as you want, and the only person who cares is you. If you're going too slow, you can go faster. You can just suck it up and just deal with the fact that you won't get that perfect word. No one else at the table is victim to the fact that you are trying to find that exactly ideal word for the situation. And I like that aspect. This is something I find most word games have not worked for me. I think there's only one other exception, and that one solves it by being cooperative and with a timer. And so same idea there, where it's the idea of, I don't like it that when a player is trying to optimize their word at the expense of everyone else's table time. As far as what I don't like in the game, first of all, because of the fact that the game doesn't have that much deck building, which we'll talk about shortly, but the game doesn't have as much deck building as you might like, I should say. The game has deck building, but across the course of the game, you're going to be adding more in terms of items and MacGuffins, and there's only a small amount of adding or upgrading the actual letters in your deck. Less so than you might think for a game that has a giant stack. I mean, this giant stack of letters over here, you're going to be going through far less of that than you might think, and as a result, your deck isn't shifting up that much, which has the side effect, the downside, that going through constantly reshuffling and shuffling and having the same letters in your face on a regular basis, it means that very often you'll find yourself resorting to similar words or word combos you've done across the course of the game. I almost wish there was more of a focus on giving more reasons to upgrade or change or augment your deck to ensure that you're not constantly using that soar again and again and again, or small modifications. Eventually you change it and now you have bore instead of soar. You're going to find yourself resorting to certain patterns that you have already figured out and found, and I do find that it happens as you go through the game. I'll say that the metal trackers in the game, for the most part, I'm fine with the components of the game. These metal trackers, it's worth noting that at least with my copy, I don't know, I can't speak for everyone's, at least with my copy, these things took a lot of time to actually work, especially on the boss tray. I found this did not want to go in, and sometimes they require a little bit of pushing and shoving, and it does eventually get better. Each time you push it in, you are wearing down the plastic a bit more, making that indent in a way that works, and I will say it's good now. Having played this a lot, it's good now, but the first few games, I was really frustrated with it and was debating trying to figure out my own system to track stuff, because they were inconsistent in terms of how bad and which tray was worse, and they were a lot. If your game comes that way, understand that it does get better, but it is frustrating. And then I'll say as well, like I mentioned already, the rulebook wasn't the best, isn't the best, not wasn't. The rulebook isn't the best and is not the cleanest experience. As far as I can see others not liking, first of all, like I mentioned, there's not a lot of deck building. That to me doesn't bother me. The fact that there's not a lot of deck building doesn't bother me in and of itself. It's just how it manifests in the wards being similar, which is more of an issue for me. Secondly, this is a game which single fights can easily last 30 to 45 minutes. Single fights against an enemy can be 30 to 45 minutes, which is not necessarily a problem, but it's a very AP prone game, and if you find yourself not interested in spending 3 hours trying to go through a run over here, well, this is a game where you might have to spend 3 hours going through a run. As far as final thoughts on Paperback Adventures, Overall, I really like this game. It gives you the fun, or it gives me the fun I want out of a Scrabble-like kind of puzzle of building out your perfect word, of coming up with a, figuring out, shuffling your cards and coming out. We have E, we have T, we have R, and we have, well, that's rote. We have rote, and we could use these if we need to, but we don't necessarily need to, and if we don't use that, we'll save an energy. So rote is a good word, but rote may or may not be the right combination for us, and trying to figure out, does this deal with the enemy as you go through it, because the enemy is constantly attacking you, and you need to make sure that you have the right combination, and the given word being right at any given moment does vary based on the top or bottom ability and how you're playing your cards and how you're trying to be reactive in different ways, and it gives you that puzzle. It just gives you an enjoyable puzzle that I find to be very rewarding, especially when you combine it with all the ways you're going to upgrade and level up and get more powerful across the game. This very much is an enjoyable experience that has some small downsides. The length is a factor. The not upgrading your cards or shifting them as much is a factor. There are definitely downsides here, but overall, I really enjoy the puzzle Paperback Adventures is giving me, and I like the solo just diving into this, spending 2-3 hours trying to come up with the perfect word again and again and again, with a high degree of enemy variety that's going to keep you invested and interested, a high degree of character variety. Each of these characters feels very different as far as when you dive into them. They give you different puzzles and different core abilities that they have, different ways to approach the same game, the same enemies. There's a lot going on here, and for the most part, it works very well for me. This one's a 4 out of 5. I really like it. It's not the perfect game for me, but I really enjoy what it's doing, and I think it's an excellent solo experience. I can't comment on the 2-player, at least not yet. As far as other game recommendations, first of all, Slay the Spire. That one's not really available. It just ended on Kickstarter as of the time of filming this, but you probably can late back that or pick it up at retail when it shows up. But very similar character arcs as far as deck building games where you take down a bunch of enemies. Very different in their actual execution, but similar on a high level. And then secondly, if you just want more word games and you don't mind some of the problems I have with those competitive word games, well, Paperback and Hardback from the same creator, from Powers Games, were the original source for this game in a more competitive, much more deck building focused kind of engine, although again, it comes with some of the problems that I personally don't like in competitive word games. In any case, this has been Paperback Adventures. I hope you found this review helpful. As always, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and I hope you have a good one.